How did Dr. Martin Luther King develop his legacy as a successful and persuasive speaker? Well, one of King's key ingredients was his style, how he spoke. We remember King in part for his marvelous metaphors, his resounding repetitions, and his vivid visualizations. Unfortunately, many speakers neglect this critical tool. Developing one's style is more than just sounding unique or entertaining your audience. Style is a subtle tool that we can use to shape our audience's understanding of their situation, persuade them, and then motivate them to act. Fortunately, we can learn how to use style to advance the goals of our speech by simply watching how others use stylistic devices. So don't leave this critical tool lying around and join us as we unpack some of the key moments from Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. So first, let's explore a basic way that King uses illusion to build his argument and credibility.
50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation.
In Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, he started with the phrase 7 years ago. King here calls to mind Lincoln by using that kind of same structure, stating 50 years ago. Lincoln also references the Lincoln Memorial behind him. In doing so, King places the civil rights movement and his call to action in his speech in line with and in continuation with what Lincoln started. So, King borrows Lincoln's reputation in the service of his argument, but illusion allows King to do so in a much more eloquent and poetic manner, as opposed to just sounding kind of forced. So, for example, King could have said something to the effect of, Lincoln Memorial is behind me, and what we are doing today is in service of Lincoln's legacy. Or he could have just said something like, Lincoln would have supported us. Now, that might have come off as a little crude. King instead uses the illusion to make the same point in a more eloquent manner. And then, after using that illusion, King moves right into his next stylistic device. So let's watch King's extended metaphor.
In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds.
Now, King's extended metaphor helps him in two ways. First, it aids his audience's memory, and it also adds an emotional impact to the speech. Think of the alternative. Think if King just said something to the effect of, the nation promised rights to all of us, but did not deliver on that promise. That certainly would have worked, but the use of the extended metaphor aids in memory and helps make it more memorable. Thinking of the blank check and not receiving money owed provides a much more tangible visualization of the problem, which aids memory. But more than that, it also adds an emotional impact, especially for those people in the audience who have not been suffering the loss of rights that they are owed. Through the metaphor, that part of the audience is able to think of not getting money that they are owed and not getting money from the bank when they thought they were going to do so. That adds a little bit of anger for them, right? They can feel the frustration of not getting what is owed, and that then helps add that emotional weight to the speech, especially for that part of the audience. Now, King is also known for his masterful use of repetition, so let's check how he uses repetition in this speech to highlight all of the problems with racial discrimination, furthering his argument and adding visualization to the argument.
There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied. As long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
Repetition highlighted all of the problems faced by African Americans in the United States and all of the lack of civil rights and the harms that is causing. The repetition helps build momentum through all of the examples that King is citing to support his argument. Many times when speakers just list off a bunch of examples, that can become kind of boring and stale. But King's repetition here builds the momentum through all of the examples and helps him show all of the evidence in support of his argument without becoming stale. Furthermore, King threw in a biblical allusion in this part of the speech, and that biblical allusion can help him build out his ethos, his moral character by showing and displaying his biblical knowledge, but it can also help him connect with key parts of his audience by identifying with them and connecting with them around their shared belief in the Bible, in Scripture, and as Christians. So it's often thought that one part of King's audience was kind of the white Christian moderate, people who could act or maybe could be persuaded to act, but oftentimes chose to remain on the sidelines. And so by using biblical allusion, he connects with that white Christian moderate, which might then help him persuade them to act. And the last line highlighted in pink is where King used that biblical allusion, a reference to Amos. King also knew how to include many stylistic devices into the same paragraph and same part of the speech for maximum effect. So let's watch him do that.
This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time.
Here King used 4 specific stylistic devices to help him respond to an opposing argument. Some people argued that the civil rights movement should wait for a more convenient time to make their argument, or perhaps they should use the courts as opposed to the kinds of demonstrations that King was doing. In general, we can refer to this argument as the gradualism argument, that they should wait for a more convenient time. And King specifically invokes that gradualism argument with a metaphor, his first stylistic device, and that's there in light blue. And that metaphor, the tranquilizing drug, helps visualize the counter-argument for his audience, right? If the civil rights movement waits, it's going to lose its momentum and it's going to go to sleep as it is being tranquilized. Then King used his second device, repetition, in the pink, to respond to that opposing argument. The repetition builds momentum and energizes the audience around the idea of acting now. Now is the time becomes a memorable phrase that implicitly refutes or responds to the idea that they should wait. The audience is remembering now is the time, so they're less likely to want to wait. King also builds on his strategy of biblical allusion to create his moral character, his ethos, and connect with the white Christian moderate. So here he is in green referencing a few biblical passages. He's referencing the passage that in Psalms that says, "Even though I walk through the valley of shadow and death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." So that's his first biblical reference. And then he also references a passage in Matthew, and that is simply in the passage in Matthew. It says that the wise men build their house on the rock, and the foolish men build their house on sand. Finally, King is using antithesis here, which is putting two contrasting ideas into the same passage. And that antithesis here then visualizes the difference in a world where the civil rights movement acted now and legislation was passed now, in a world where it's not. And so he uses all of his knowledge about stylistic devices, packs them together to respond to the argument that the civil rights movement should wait. So what are some of the key lessons that we learned from King about how we can use stylistic devices to help us persuade and motivate our audience to act? First, we've learned two things about allusions and how they can help us achieve our goal. First, we saw King use allusions in the beginning of his speech to provide credibility for his speech and to evidence his argument, and that's all of his allusions to Lincoln. Second, we learned that allusions can help us build connections with our audience, as King is alluding to biblical passages that helps him build his connection and credibility with the Christians in his audience. We also learned about how we can use metaphors to shape our audience's understanding and thus help us support our speech. The first way we learned that is through the situation, how King portrayed the situation as if people were getting bad checks. We also saw how King used metaphors to respond to an opposing counter-argument, the idea that the movement should wait, and he used that tranquilizing drug metaphor to show and visualize how bad it would be if the movement stopped, because it would cause the movement to go to sleep. Third, we learned that repetition can help us show the amount of evidence that we have while still building momentum. And we also saw how repetition can help energize our audience in ways that affirm our point and respond to, at least implicitly, to those opposing arguments. And that's how King built a legacy around the ways that he used style to build his argument and persuade his audience. He infused stylistic devices throughout his speech to develop his point. Now, to help you learn the ways that you can start using more stylistic devices, I've created a series of videos about individual stylistic devices, so I encourage you to check those out to help you build more persuasive and motivating speeches.